G'day and welcome to the Culture Couch Live North American edition. Dave, Carly and Brucey, how are we?
Morning.
Hey, Emile, how are you?
Morning, Emile.
See you all, the miracle of Zoom, and all you guys living in Melbourne, where I am now in Toronto. It's a beautiful 25 degrees. You're outside there, Dave. What's the temperature out there, mate?
Yeah, pretty fresh. It's under 10 degrees, so single figures first day of winter, Em.
Yeah. Well, Dave, you lived in Toronto for a little while as well, and you would have felt the Canadian winter here, but the Melbourne winters aren't much better at times, are they?
No, we mightn't have snow, but it's bloody chilly though.
Absolutely. So, guys, today we're going to introduce the world, North America, to Performance by Design. I'm based here in Toronto, managing the North American office. And we've got Paul Roos, AFL legend, 456-game player turned premiership coach. Carly Leach, our newest team member, who comes from the media ad agency world, and Dave Nissen, a director of high performance through many sporting organisations in Australia. So we've got a fantastic team. We're going to touch on who we are as an organisation, what we stand for, and a bit of a background as well. So we'll probably start with you, Roosie, if that's okay. You've got a great career as a great player and then turned coach. So tell viewers a bit about your story from playing to coaching and how you got into the world of culture and performance.
Yeah, I'll try and sort of connect the dots, Emile, as we go through. So I arrived at Fitzroy Footy Club as a young kid, and it was sort of semi-professional. And I had no idea about culture or behaviours or leadership or empowerment. We were sort of part-time, training in the afternoon, training in the morning pre-season. So it's probably, I think, about 4 or 5 years in, I started to think about what culture is. And it simply was the behaviours that people reward and challenge. And it was quite interesting. And I really got fascinated how much impact the actual leaders, the role model leaders, not so much the coach, because the coach was, again, part-time. Wolsey was a school teacher. But it was a real leaders, the player group that had an impact on me because of their behaviours. Yeah. So then when I took over as coach of Sydney Swans, I sort of thought to myself, well, there's one or two ways you can go about it. You can just employ really good people and get really good leaders, which sort of works, or you can try and take the chance out of culture. So we embarked on a program where we actually formulated our set of behaviours. So it was the first time it had ever been done in Australian rules football. We clearly sat down. Misso was with me. Misso was my high performance manager at Sydney. So we did it at Coffs Harbour. So we came up with a roadmap, and I called it a roadmap, a blueprint for everyone. And then what we did at Sydney, the first time it ever been done, we actually picked our leadership group based on our behaviours. And it's a model now that's followed by every footy club pretty much. It became the norm, but it really was a leap of faith. So to me, that probably sums up a bit what we do, Emile. It's how do we take the chance out of culture? We do it by setting a really clear framework about how we want to act. We want to make sure our role model leaders are behaving that way first and foremost, and then we reward and challenge, and we just have really open and honest conversations. And for those of you who don't know, which would be most people in North America, I'd imagine, haven't got an AFL footy team, Emile. So the Sydney Swans won their first premiership in 72 years in 2005 after 3 years after we embarked on the program. So it was a really significant moment in sport, but in leadership in general.
Yeah, absolutely. So for you viewers out there, the AFL is the equivalent to the NFL or the NHL or the MLB for Aussie rules football, not rugby. But we might even put a little link into some AFL highlights for viewers out there that don't know the sport so well. Carly, you've got a huge background in the corporate space. And that's where most of our work is today. We know our model started in sport and moved to corporate, but 98% of what we do today is in the corporate space. As your journey from your world into our world at PBD and consulting and so forth, what are you seeing? What does it look like in the corporate world for you when you see a great culture, and what do you see when you see a poor culture in your experience?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, Emile, because I think we all know how important leadership is, and I don't think people really understand that you can learn to be a great leader. I think people automatically come up through the ranks, they get into leadership roles because they're very good technically at what they do, and then they get promoted and they end up in a leadership role. And and then people are looking up to them every single day, but they're not necessarily really understanding what they're doing and how they're influencing, I guess, other people's behaviours in the team.
Yeah.
And that's what's really interesting about the work that we do, and coming from the corporate world, that there really is a science around developing a high-performing team, and there's some really key elements to make sure that you get that amazing culture.
Yeah.
But I definitely don't think there's an awareness from all leaders about how to do that, and that's why an external consultant like us is really important, because you have that independent view, you have the fresh eyes that come in, and you can really help people see what they're missing, I guess. And that link is really around what are the behaviours that link to our values that we are accepting and we're rewarding. And then how do we hold people accountable for that? And the influence of leaders I think is really important, and that can't be underestimated.
Absolutely.
So they're kind of, and then again, the way Ruzi and another one of our founders, Jared, talks a lot about the differences between corporate and sport. And the two key differences really, Ruzi, are the review process in terms of the really stringent amount of time sport spends reviewing their behaviour and their performance. And in the corporate world, I remember my team, I would say, we've got to have our reviews, it's quarterly. Have you done them? And everyone would just put it to the bottom of the list, and it would go on for weeks and weeks and months. And, part of our process is really making sure that it doesn't have to be a formal check-in, but it has to be regular, those little and often check-ins, to make sure that we're always talking about performance.
Yeah.
Well, I think what Carly said, there, was really interesting. Like, I think what happens sometimes, the leader actually doesn't really know. And then now this is not a criticism, because they're technically very good at what they do, but they just haven't been upskilled on what leadership is. So then they tend to just leave it because they're not really sure what actually it looks like. So the longer they leave it, the potentially, now if you've got really good people, it's gonna hum along reasonably nice. Yeah, but it's really just people-based. I talk about talent-based teams or behavioural-based teams. But if you get in and formulate it, so for anyone out there as a leader is feeling, not embarrassed is not the right word, but sitting there going, I don't really know, don't be embarrassed. Like most of the leaders we work with, including myself, when I started Misso, bring you into the conversation, it was just a leap of faith for me. I didn't really know exactly. But that self-awareness piece, I think, is a really important part as a leader. Don't think you know everything. Ask questions. Admit when you're wrong. I think there's some notions around leadership which then lead us, Carly, to making that phone call and saying, Em, can you come in? Can you help us? And once they make the phone call, it's just a completely different conversation.
Yeah, you're right there. There's a sense of relief after the first few training sessions with us that I can breathe again and go, right, now I've got a bit of space because the higher you get up, the more you've got to spend it on your leadership thinking a little bit, don't you? And Carly, you raised a good point. It's people know they want a great culture. They don't necessarily know how to get it. And it's still over here. Most of my career has actually been over here in North America. And it's still wrapped around that notion, your culture's about parties, perks, and ping pong. Right? Yeah. I think what we're hoping to bring to the North American market is a genuine understanding it's driven by behaviour. So if we're going to review performance, we need to look at our results and the behaviours that are getting us those results. And if we actually focus on the behaviours, as you like to say, Ruzi, the scoreboard, Bill Walsh as well, the scoreboard will take care of itself. Behaviours, relationships, real talk.
That's what we say in our course, though, isn't it? It's behaviour is what you do and what you say.
Actions, and
your actions. And that's a bit of a mindset shift in terms of it's not just who you are, it's what you do. And you can really influence what you do, and you can change that. If you
I think the other thing, Carly, you mentioned is to learn skill. And Misso might bring you into the conversation.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, you've been in the sporting background similar to me, but you're studying now. I guess before I hand you back to Emile, because the two of you work really well together in Toronto in this space. But in terms of learning, what have you learned through that leadership course?
Yeah,
I think the thing that stands out most for me, guys, is so much research now around shared leadership. And it's one thing that I noticed being up in Canada is that there's a fairly hierarchical leadership structure. Like it's a top-down creation of culture, whereas so much research now is a bottom-up development of your culture, and leaders understanding that for them to become better leaders, it's about sharing the load from a leadership point of view.
Yeah.
And that's the way that you embed a culture into an organisation, because you have so many people exhibiting the values and behaviours that you want to see.
But that's about having the vulnerability or the understanding to let you empower your team and let them help you make those decisions, which is also not an easy skill to understand, right?
No.
And it's an absolute correlation with so much research that I'm seeing now, is that great leaders are seen to be great leaders because they empower others.
Yeah. Love it. Yeah. It's about creating that environment for other people to perform. You know, we like to use that analogy of the player coach syndrome. You know, in sport, I'm sure, Ruzi, in your experience, you would have loved to have jumped on the field many a time and taken a kick at certain players, but you simply can't. But in the corporate space, we see it day in, day out. And that's why the high-performing individuals who get promoted into leadership roles have to move away from the doing to the empowering, right? And, you know, I love the term, you know, the old leadership style was directive and problem solving. I reckon the better way to look at that equation is problem empowering. To your point, Dave, how do we problem empower?
It's very hard to do, Emile, though. I will say that. For someone who, you know, wants to be a fixer and a doer, to get into those leadership roles and to see people underneath you stuff it up is actually really difficult to do.
I think one thing that, you know, really is the cornerstone of an empowerment model is role clarity. And to me, you know, with the team that we had, Ruzi, in 2005 with the Swans, every single player ran out on the field every game knowing exactly what was expected of them. And there's no difference in the corporate environment either, you know, and it's something that we really push strongly in our process, is that leaders really establish that role clarity with their team.
I agree. Emile, let me ask you a question, because you've got this funny Australian accent, but you've actually been in Canada for a long period of time. What's your analysis of Canada and the culture and what you've seen over? Well, how long has it been?
Well, 99 was the first time I came here for a student exchange at the University of Western Ontario, which everyone in Toronto will know. And then 201, 203, 203, I came back and I started a little business running around schools, teaching kids how to play Aussie rules football. Came back after 4 or 5 years in 208 and actually made it a proper business. Was like catching public transport to schools with a Bauer hockey bag filled with balls, which was pretty funny. But from 208 to 216, I built a company called Aussie X, which went on Dragon's Den over here, actually. So I think we're the only Australian group that was on that show. Pretty interesting. Anyway, it really rose us to prominence quite quickly. But at that time in 2011, all my leadership gaps were coming to the foreground, mostly around bottlenecking, making all the decisions, or letting everyone come to me. And secondly, an inability to have an honest conversation. Fantastic at rewarding positivity and great behaviour. But when something didn't work well, I tended to have it on my shoulder. And then we got well known. So the business started to grow at a very rapid rate. And luckily I knew of Jared Murphy, our business partner, and he was living in England, flew Jez over. He worked with the team at Aussie X. And literally I just did everything he told me to. And the more and more we did more of the work, the less and less of the work I actually did in the company. So it definitely took me from a place of pain, and it's now my purpose, because I was getting a bit tingles before, thinking about when you actually do help a leader who's, you know, they're just beaten down, they're tired, they're not getting quality time with their kids or whatever, they're sacrificing their own life and well-being for the management of their company, and you can help them in 1, 2, 3 months get that space. It's really, really rewarding.
I think too, Emma, it's important. I mean, we talk about storytelling a lot. I think it's important to hear your story, because having facilitated a lot with you over the years, you are able to navigate their problems because you've lived their problems. And I think one of the strengths of a number of our founders is they're actually, yourself and Warren sort of started using the program before you actually became a director of our company. And Carly, this is a great thing for us. Carly's husband, you maybe tell that story, and then Miss the connection with Miss O and me. So we all sort of live and breathe the values, which is really cool.
You share that, Carly. I'd love your perspective of your husband's experience, because it's much more enjoyable to listen to from you.
Well, I don't know if I tell it the right way because I'm sort of once removed. But look, my husband has a business that was growing quite rapidly, a tech context startup that he started back in 2015, so it's nearly 7 years ago now. And through LinkedIn, knew about Ruzi's profile and knew about the business and what he'd done, and then got in touch with Ruzi and said, look, I know culture is really important, but I probably don't really know what to do. So Emile, you and Ruzi went and worked with the team, and as a startup and as any business, you have a lot of those kind of teething issues. You have, a founding group who have all got big personalities and who all want to go in different directions. Then you want to make the company, more corporate and bigger, and you're starting to talk to, raising money and venture capital, and how do you develop your teams and what should they look like? So the program has really assisted the business to get to that next stage. And I think the part that, Ben talks to me about a lot on a day-to-day basis is how the concepts have impacted the individuals. So, like one guy who said, now that I know how to have these conversations and how to address some of these issues, I've never had a good relationship with my in-laws, and now I understand the profiling and concepts.
Yeah, right.
That's amazing. Yeah.
So we're not just helping the actual team in their work environment. We're helping each individual, and they're thinking and they're learning and they're developing, and that's helping them in their individual lives as well, which
great point.
They've gone on in the past 18 months, it's really improved the way their performance is today.
Well, we had that story the other day, Ruzi, with one of our teams in Australia, where the guy spoke to the big boss, the CEO, about through the program he's learned how to publicly speak, and he spoke at his father's funeral. He said to him, I wouldn't have been able to do that, which I thought was really special as well. But just
I think that's why we say your story is good, because I think your background and our background, but the fact that you've done the leadership component of it, most people don't sort of study it. Yep. So that's what we find. So again, not to be embarrassed. So is there 2 or 3 points, Miss O, that you want to finish on potentially of the learnings? I know you've touched on a little bit, but what are maybe a couple of things that surprised you or just reinforced your views?
Yeah, I think, look, the main one, and I've spoken about this a bit, is, that leadership is actually a skill. It's a skill that needs to be learned, and it needs to be nurtured, and it needs to continually be developed. And I think, one of us made a point earlier that leaders mostly get thrust into leadership positions because they have technical expertise, but then when they get put in these positions, they're not given the right development and learnings to be a better leader. And that's obviously one of the features of our program. Probably the second thing for me, and it's something I really observed strongly in Canada, and I think it's a worldwide thing, is that people struggle to have those honest and sometimes difficult conversations. And again, it's a really strong feature of our process is to teach people how to have difficult conversations and honest conversations, and to give each other feedback. And it's a really important part of not only developing as a leader, but developing as a person.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll close the loop on that and we'll finish up in a second. But Ruzi, part of your question before was the differences between Canada and North America and Australia. And that's probably one of the big ones. I find Australian business culture where we're pretty good with the open conversations, but we jump in with humour too much.
Yeah.
Americans, I've worked a lot in America, they're a bit at each other. They're a bit too combative, and they don't fully understand the concept of team at times. And here in Canada, the real talk is the part. It's a bit, let's have the second meeting, right?
Yep.
So you can really move the needle. And Dave, we had an experience ourselves with the team we worked over here. When you can get that open and honest conversation, because there's a lot of honest ones going on, they're just not in the open.
Yeah.
And I think that's the part over here that we're helping so many Canadian teams with, is having that in the right setting. So now we can actually problem solve together, and then we move in the same direction. And otherwise we're scattered and we waste a lot of time, which people don't have that anymore. People are exhausted. We're still in lockdown here in Toronto. So to your point, Ruzi, if anyone's out there who needs a bit of support to understand where they're at today and potentially a bit of a process, please reach out to us at Performance by Design. That's episode 1 done and dusted. Thanks, guys. We'll see you again next time here on the Culture Couch Live North America.